Welcome back to our first video lecture for the semester. We're going to cover chapter 9, which is called capital budgeting. Over the last few weeks, we talked about chapters 7 and 8. We covered the main sources of financing for a firm. Firm can get financing in 3 different ways: from its stock, from its bonds, or from its own savings account. So we talked about those 3 sources of financing, and now we need to talk about what a firm does with the financing. Because remember that a firm doesn't raise money just for fun. A firm raises financing in order to invest it. And that decision is the majority part of what the finance team at a major corporation is going to be engaged in. And it comes down to a few simple questions. And the first one is something we alluded to right way back at the beginning of the semester, which is, what does this firm do? Because remember, a firm has to make a choice about what it is. If we're McDonald's, then we sell burgers. If we're Pizza Hut, then we sell pizza. And so our investment decisions are going to be guided by this central choice that we make, which is, what do? If I'm Pizza Hut, my investment choices are going to involve things like deciding what kind of pizzas to roll out to all my stores, or whether I should open up new stores, or whether I should start selling dessert, or whether we should move into a country that we've never opened up a store into. They're not going to include things like whether I should start selling tires, or whether we should invest in a spaceship to engage in the space race. Those things aren't what Pizza Hut does. On the other hand, we could be a firm like Apple or Amazon or Google, in which case the criterion by which we invest are much broader, because Amazon doesn't really do any one thing anymore. Sure, they started off by selling books, but these days they do pretty much everything. They make the majority of their money by selling server space. They also sell all kinds of retail and wholesale products, but they're moving into any number of new investment industries, and they're going to need financing to do all those things. So once we've decided what the firm does, and again, this isn't a static decision, we can broaden or shrink the scope of the firm over time. But once we've decided what the firm does in general, the next question is, what kind of projects should we do? What kind of investments are available to us? And we're going to have lots of different available investments. This isn't usually the role of the finance team to identify the investments. In fact, typically what happens is the other teams in the firm are going to identify the investments first. We might have operations teams, or we might have different divisions engaged in different things, and all of those divisions are going to be the boots on the ground, so to speak. And those are the kinds of people that are developing new investment opportunities. So we've got a division that says, oh, we want to do X, right? If we're GE, maybe we have a light bulb division, and 10 years ago the light bulb division was saying, listen, we need to invest in LED technology. All light bulbs, traditional light bulbs are going to be obsolete by the time LEDs become scalable and a decent price, so we need to invest in that. You're going to get these investment opportunities and ideas from all over the company, from every different group. They're all going to send it to the central finance team, and the finance team is going to have to analyze each of these projects and decide what to invest in. So what we're going to talk about today is these 3 things. First is, how do we decide what to invest in? We're going to have to think about how to analyze what project is a good project. And then we're going to have to look back, and this is a couple chapters ahead, but we're going to have to look back and analyze the decisions that we make now at some point in the future. Because remember that what we're going to do here is we're going to analyze projects that haven't been taken yet. So we're going to make a lot of assumptions about the future, and remember, one of the things I want you to take away from this class is that we can't predict the future, and we're always going to be wrong if we try. And so we're going to try to predict the future here by analyzing a project that hasn't happened. And the only way for us ever to get any better at that is to look back once the project is over and try to see if we've made any mistakes. Try to look at all the projects that we've decided to invest in, try and look at all the decisions we've made and see if they were good or bad, and if there's any kind of pattern that we can analyze that will bring out those good or bad choices and help us make better ones in the future. This whole process is called the practice of capital budgeting. And capital budgeting means exactly what it sounds like. Capital is the financing that the firm uses to make investments, and we only have a limited amount of that capital, which means we need to budget it across a potentially larger set of projects than we have the potential to invest in. And so what we're going to do broadly or mostly in this chapter is look at the rules that have been developed by the financial economists that allow us to decide whether a project is good or bad. So this is not the point where we're going to be deciding what the firm invests in overall, in other words, what we do. And this isn't the point where we're going to be analyzing our decisions. We're purely going to try to make some calls. Is this a good project or is this a bad project? And in pursuit of that goal, we're going to look at 6 different decision rules. The net present value rule, the payback rule, the discounted payback rule, the average accounting return, the internal rate of return rule, and the profitability index. And just to get it out of the way, the first one is the golden rule, what we call the net present value, or NPV. This is the rule that should guide all our decision making. As long as we can have the requisite information and feel confident in our assumptions, the NPV rule is going to give us the best and cleanest answer. The other rules exist because in certain scenarios or in certain cases, we either don't want to use the NPV rule, or we don't want to take the time or effort or investment that it requires to do the net present value rule. And so it may just be easier to use one of these other ones if not as much is at stake, for example. So we'll talk about the different cases, and we'll talk about when and where to apply them. And as we walk our way through, we're going to look at each rule individually, but we're going to do it with this same project. And that way we can evaluate each of the rules using the same information, and we can use that to compare and contrast the rules and see how they differ, see where one goes right and one goes wrong. And as we walk our way through, we're sort of going to be asking ourselves a series of questions about how good this rule is. So we're going to ask ourselves, for instance, does the rule adjust for the time value of money? We know that this is the fundamental thing about finance, is that time and money have interlinked and intrinsic values. And so we want to know that if we're making a decision about a project, we have thought about how the time value of money affects our choice. We want to ask whether the decision rule adjusts for risk, because we just learned a couple of fundamental rules of finance, and one of them is that risk and return trade off 1 for 1. And so if we're evaluating a project that promises a very high return, well, we should expect that it comes with a very high risk. That's how risk and return work. So we want to make sure that our decision rule takes into account the potential that very high return projects come with very high risk. Then we want to ask whether the decision rule creates value for the firm, because after all, that's what we are engaged in. Remember that a manager's job is to maximize shareholder value. And so any project that we take should create additional value for the firm. And then finally, a little tongue-in-cheek, we ask, should we be using a different rule in this case? And the general answer is yes, we should always be using the NPV rule if we can. But these other rules have their place, and so we'll talk about what those place is. And we'll start with the golden rule, net present value, or what everyone will call by its initialism, NPV. The net present value is a very straightforward rule. The net present value of an investment or a firm or a project is simply the difference between the present value of its future cash flows and its cost. In other words, how much money is going to be raised or brought in from the project over time minus its cost. And so this gives us a very direct measure of how much value is created when we take the project on or when we make the investment. Now, one of the major drawbacks about the NPV is that it is not a simple or easy process to engage in. In fact, it's a very complex process. And we're only going to do a small part of that here, but I want you to be aware of the overall process of establishing the net present value. Right? So the first thing that we do is we need to estimate the expected future cash flows. Remember, this project hasn't happened yet. And these cash flows haven't occurred. So what we want to do is we want to look into the future and try and decide what we think is most likely going to happen for the firm. If our new project is we're Pizza Hut and we're opening up a new store, we're estimating revenues for the store, costs, how many employees do we need, what's our marketing budget for a new project, what kind of taxes are we going to face in this new location. There are any number of different things that we need to evaluate, and essentially we're going to take a look at the income statement and balance sheet and try and predict for this new firm, this new store, predict the income statement and the balance sheet out for several years. Right? This is probably the hardest part of the project, and it's the part that takes the most number of assumptions. Remember, our assumptions are always wrong. We're going to try and do our best, and if we're a company like Pizza Hut, we're pretty good at opening up pizza stores, so our assumptions are probably going to be better than most. But still, these are predictions about the future, and we could be wrong. The second step is we need to estimate the required return for projects like this. And really what that means is we need to estimate how risky it is, because risk and return go hand in hand. And we haven't really talked about this in class yet, and again, this is like the final part of the class where we'll get to talking about how to estimate risk and return. But this is a really, really fundamental piece of this puzzle, and when we talk about the internal rate of return, we'll talk about how fundamental and how important this is. But we need to think about the risk, because the more risk involved in the investment, the higher required return we must input into the model, and that means we're going to have a lower chance of taking the project. And then the final step, which is what we're going to do here, the final step is to take the present values of the cash flows and subtract the investment. And really, it might not seem like that right at first, but this is the easy part, because usually we're going to have a calculator or we're going to have Excel do this for us. Right? So we're going to plug in all the predicted cash flows that the firm is going to generate. We'll take the present value of each cash flow, we'll add them all up, and we'll subtract the initial investment. And so we'll jump right into some examples here.